Hello and welcome to Meditation Monday. I know that this video is coming on late. I got a little sidetracked with some other things, but here we are now, and I'm glad that you have joined me. I hope that you're enjoying the series of lessons about women in the Bible, presented by women of faith, and that you will continue to come back and listen and enjoy a short moment each Monday, just learning a little bit more about the will of God, lessons we can apply to our lives, and learning about women that are in the Bible, which played an important role. My story today, however, and if you're following my sort of train of, or my series, I guess you could say, I'm following the Bible chronologically, I guess you could say. So I've made it up to Genesis 19. Last time I spoke to you about Sarah and Hagar, and now we're moving just past that to Lot's daughters. We did talk a little bit about Lot and his wife, and if you remember, God was going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their evil. There was so much evil in those two cities that there just literally was nothing good. But Abraham took pity on his nephew Lot and appealed to God, and so God, spared Lot, his wife, and his two daughters. And but he said, "Don't look back. Just make sure you keep going. Otherwise, calamity could happen to you." And Lot's wife looked back, and so because of that, she turned into a pillar of salt, and in other words, she died. Now, back in those days, and Genesis 19 clearly spells this out. I know Kai touched on this as well in her last video last week, that back in those days, and literally even today, having children is something that it's seen as, what's the word I want to put? It's seen as something that's just going to happen. Like every girl is going to grow up and get married and have a child. And if you did get married, having children was supposed to be the most important thing. Now, times change, cultures change, things change. And so the emphasis on having children isn't what it used to be. But back then, it was a big deal. And so Lot had these two daughters, and he was afraid to go live in the town of Zoar, even though God had, created this place that was supposed to be sort of a safe haven for them. Lot was a scaredy cat, so to speak, and he did not want to live there. So he took his two daughters, and they were living in a cave. Now, the terrain back there, and you've probably seen some of the images that we've seen on TV a lot of times, because back in that whole area around the Dead Sea, the desert and whatnot, below the Dead Sea and around that whole area, it's some pretty rugged wilderness type terrain. And they did have, a little bit of mountainous regions, but they had a lot of caves. So he and his two daughters are living in this cave. And one day, the two daughters were having a conversation with each other away from their father. And the oldest daughter says to the younger, she says, we're not going to be able to get married and have children, which is what we're supposed to do. And she said, so I'm going to hatch this plan. And the plan was, let's get Dad drunk, and I'll go in first and lay with him and get pregnant. And then the next day we'll do it again. And then you can go in and lay with him and get pregnant. And then at least this way we will have children that will carry on for us. They were pretty convinced they were never going to meet anybody, that they would just be living in a cave the rest of their lives. You kind of have to wonder to yourself, well, if you think you're going to live in a cave and never get married, right? Then why would you want to bring children into that situation? But in their mind, they weren't thinking about the future. They were just thinking about the moment and feeling sorry for themselves about, oh, we live in this cave. What are we going to do? We're never going to have they had no trust in in God, because to be honest with you, God was not their God. And we'll get into that in a minute. So they just, they went on, feeling sorry for themselves, so to speak. So they did exactly what they said they were going to do. The very next night, they made sure their dad got super drunk. The oldest daughter went in and basically had sex with her father. And then the next night, the younger daughter did as well. What's incredible to me is that the Bible only kind of intimates that they did this one time, and both of them got pregnant. I find that really interesting, given that some people have to, have that intimacy more than once to get pregnant, but both of them in a one-time thing got pregnant. So the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about them is a couple of things. They ended up each having a boy. The oldest daughter, her son's name was Moab, and the younger daughter's son was named Ammon. And they became the Moabites and the Ammonites, which later the Bible gets into a lot more. I'm going to just touch on it today. But anyway, so they each had a boy, and they named him, and Moab, by the way, means of the father. So, why you would want to name your son knowing that you just had sex with your father, and then remind yourself of that, I don't know, but they did. Now, the reason I bring this up is for a couple of things. Number one, in no way does the Bible condone what they did. And in fact, what happens is the choices that we make most times will have repercussions or consequences that are good. It depends. Depends on what your choices are, right? In this particular case, not a lot of good came from it, but not all bad either. So first of all, having sexual intercourse with your parent is wrong, okay? It's just wrong. I don't know any culture anywhere that says that's okay. So that's number one. And then what happens later is they don't really talk a lot. First of all, we don't know the daughters' names, and they don't really talk a lot about it after that until much later. But what I can tell you is that some good did come from this situation way down the road. And we're going to get into that story. I'm sure someone, either myself or someone, will do a video on Ruth. But if you read later, and I don't want to do too much on Ruth right now because, I'm sure Ruth is one of my favorites, and we're going to really get into that later. But Ruth's two daughters-in-law came from Moab. Okay, now where did they end up settling? If you remember when Abraham and Lot split up, Lot went one way and Abraham went another. So they were kind of already in the general area of the Dead Sea. But Ammon and Moab ended up in the northern and eastern part of the Dead Sea. So they're kind of more, there was a river, Jordan there, and there was a little bit more fertile land away from the Dead Sea. But anyway, they're in that general area. Ammon was more northern, and Moab was sort of bordered in the length of the Dead Sea. And we will find out later that David has connections to that area. Moses is going to have connections to that area, and Ruth, and it just goes on and on. Why? Because the bad part of what happened, the consequence of what happened, is that they did not worship God, the God of Israel. In the Bible, it talks a lot about the God of Israel because God watched over his people. He specifically created a group of people to bring Jesus Christ to us way down the road. But he wanted to preserve a group of people that would follow him and him alone. So Moab's people, when they, departed and went away from Abraham, because Abraham believed in God, when Lot and them split up, they went off and Moab worshipped a god they created called Chemosh, and Amnon created a god that they called, I'm going to forget now. Drat. Okay, well, I can't remember the name of the god, but anyway, and that's interesting because they're brothers, or I guess they're cousins. I don't know, it's kind of odd. But anyway, they both were in the general vicinity of each other, but they both worshiped different gods. And neither of them worshiped the God of Israel. They knew about the God of Israel because of their uncle Abraham, but they did not worship the God of Israel. So that's important. But there will be some good that comes from it. There'll be some stories where, like I said, surrounding with David, some surrounding with Ruth, lots of good. But generally speaking, Moab and Ammon, the Moabites and the Ammonites did not like the Israelites, and there was a lot of fighting, and they fought over territory, because the Israelites eventually are going to want to move up above the Dead Sea, but they got to get past them to get there. Fortunately, the God of Israel is a lot more powerful than their fake gods. So the story will turn out to be good in the long run, but they really never got along very well. There was some times of peace, because it will, Bethlehem comes into the story in relationship to Moab. There's a lot of interconnections that go on later down the road. Now, the only reason I wanted to bring up Lot's daughters, even though we don't have names for them and whatnot, is because it's important for us to remember that the choices we make will have consequences. And they may not have consequences in the moment. They could have consequences down the road for our ancestors, our heritage, our children to come. Generations of children to come could end up having troubles because of the choices we make. And it's very important that our trust in God overpowers our need for our own, what we think is supposed to be right. Did they really need to have children? No. But in that cultural time, it was a big deal not to have them. Yet, they didn't have a God like we do that we can put our trust in. They didn't understand that in time, God might lead them to something better. Instead, they did something that was wrong. And the consequences of that traveled throughout many generations. That same thing can happen to us. God talks a little bit about this when he says the sins of the father. And we're not blamed for our, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts. We're not blamed for their actions. We are responsible for our own actions and our own choices, but the consequences of what we do can wreak havoc, or it can be good, things for good as well. When we get to the story of Ruth and whatnot, there's a lot of good that comes from the story of the Moabites, Ammonites, the Israelites, but lots and lots of trouble. Okay, so this is my short moment to get you kind of interested in digging into the Bible. We are in Genesis chapter 19. Like I said, I started us out in chapter 1, and I'm just kind of flowing through the Bible, pulling out the women that I encounter there that I feel like present a lesson that we can contemplate. I hope that each one of us will take time, breathe first, think first before we act, and remind ourselves that we're not the only one that is affected by our choices. I hope you'll tune in next Monday. You never know, it could be me or it could be someone else. But regardless, please tell your friends, think about subscribing and supporting this endeavor to encourage other people. Doesn't have to just be women. Encourage people to look into the Bible for the will of God and make everything better in your life because of it. Okay? See you next Monday. Peace and love. Bye.